The room remained silent. No one dared interrupt. David looked first at Emily, then at Ethan. For a long moment he simply studied their faces, not as adults, but as the little boy and girl he and Margaret had raised. Finally he spoke. "When your mother and I built our home, we didn't dream about leaving you money. We dreamed about leaving you security." He paused, and somewhere along the way, we all forgot the difference. Emily wiped away her tears. "Dad, I know saying sorry isn't enough." David nodded gently. "You're right, it isn't." The words stung, but they were true. He turned toward Ethan. "You made mistakes." Ethan lowered his head. "I did. I should have stopped everything the moment Emily started talking about selling the house. I knew it didn't feel right, but I was afraid of disappointing her, afraid of losing what I thought would eventually belong to us." David looked at him carefully. "Fear explains a mistake. It doesn't excuse it." Ethan nodded. "I know." Jonathan remained quietly seated, allowing David to lead the conversation. David reached into his jacket pocket and carefully unfolded Margaret's letter. "I spent all night reading this, again and again. Do you know what I realized?" Neither of his children answered. "Your mother never wrote this letter because she wanted revenge. She wrote it because she hoped our family could survive even if we failed each other." Emily covered her mouth as fresh tears rolled down her face. "I failed both of you," she whispered. "I failed Mum too." David walked slowly toward the window. Outside, the morning sun lit the city streets. Life continued as it always had. People hurried to work. Children laughed as they walked to school. The world had not stopped because one family had fallen apart. "But our family doesn't have to end today," David said quietly. He turned back around. "I've made my decision." Emily held her breath. Ethan stood perfectly still. Jonathan opened a blank legal form, ready to record David's instructions. David spoke clearly. "The Harrison Family Trust will remain exactly as Margaret designed it." Jonathan nodded. "I understand. No one will ever be allowed to sell this home while I'm alive." Jonathan wrote down every word. David continued. "Ethan," his son looked up, "you admitted your mistakes before anyone forced you to. You accepted responsibility. That doesn't erase what happened, but it tells me your character isn't beyond saving." Ethan's eyes filled with tears. "I'm giving you a second chance." Ethan broke down completely. "I won't, I promise." David placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. "I hope you don't." Then he faced Emily. She looked terrified. "I've spent my whole life loving you, and I always will. But love without accountability isn't love. It's permission." Emily nodded through tears. "I understand, so here's my decision. Your inheritance will remain suspended." Emily closed her eyes. David continued before she could speak. "Not forever, but until you prove, not with words, but with actions, that people matter more to you than possessions." Emily looked at him in surprise. "You're giving me a chance?" "I'm giving you an opportunity. The chance is yours to earn." She sobbed quietly. "I will. I don't expect you to believe me today, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying." David gave a small, tired smile. "I hope you do." Jonathan finished writing and slid the documents across the table. David signed them, then Ethan signed as a witness. Emily signed to acknowledge the updated trust conditions. The legal battle that everyone expected never happened, because the law had already done its job. What remained was healing. 6 months later, the old Harrison house looked alive again. The flower beds had been restored. The front porch had been repainted. The broken fence Ethan once repaired had been completely rebuilt, this time by father and son working side by side. Emily visited every Saturday, not to discuss money, not to ask questions about the estate. She came with groceries. She helped clean the house. Sometimes she simply sat beside her father on the porch. For months, they spoke very little. Trust returned slowly, exactly as it should. One crisp autumn afternoon, David, Emily, Ethan, and Jonathan stood together at the local community college. A new scholarship was being announced. It was called the Margaret Harrison Legacy Scholarship. Each year, it would help young people who wanted to learn skilled trades but couldn't afford the training. David stood at the podium. He looked at the audience before smiling softly. "My wife believed that building something with your hands also builds your character. I can't think of a better way to honor her." The room erupted into warm applause. Later that evening, David drove alone to the cemetery. The autumn leaves drifted gently across the grass. He placed a bouquet of white lilies beside Margaret's headstone. For a while he said nothing, then he smiled. "You were right, Maggie. They lost their way, but maybe they've started finding the road home." A cool breeze rustled the trees overhead. David closed his eyes for a moment. For the first time since Margaret's passing, the silence no longer felt empty. It felt peaceful. He gently touched the engraved letters of her name. "Thank you," he whispered, "for protecting me one last time." As he walked back toward his car, the setting sun bathed the cemetery in a warm golden light. Behind him stood the woman who had protected her family with wisdom. Ahead of him walked the man who had finally understood her greatest gift. Not a house, not an inheritance, but the courage to choose justice without losing compassion. Because the greatest legacy we leave behind is never measured by what we own. It is measured by the people we help become better than they were yesterday. David unlocked the front door just as the sun began to set. For the first time in decades, the house felt unfamiliar, not because anything had changed, because everything had. He quietly hung his jacket on the old wooden coat rack Margaret had insisted on keeping, even after they could easily afford a new one. "It still works," she used to say with a smile. "So why replace it?" David gently ran his hand across the worn wood. He could almost hear her laughter echoing through the hallway. The silence that followed felt almost unbearable. Instead of turning on the television as he usually did, he walked into the living room and opened the old cedar chest beneath the window. Inside were dozens of photo albums. Margaret had labeled everyone by hand. First home. Emily's childhood, Ethan's baseball years, family holidays. David picked up the oldest album. The first photograph showed a young Margaret standing in front of an empty plot of land. She was laughing while holding a blueprint. The caption underneath, written in her handwriting, read, "One day we'll build our forever home." David smiled through tears. Back then, they had almost nothing. He worked 6 days a week as a carpenter. Margaret taught music lessons from the dining room to help pay the mortgage. They skipped holidays, they drove old cars, they counted every pound they spent, but they never complained, because every sacrifice brought them one step closer to building a future for their children. David slowly turned another page. There was Emily at 6 years old, proudly holding the first tomato she had grown in the back garden. Another page showed Ethan covered in paint after helping decorate his bedroom. Neither child had cared how much the house was worth. To them, it had simply been home. David closed the album. "When did everything become about money?" he whispered into the empty room. There was no answer, only silence. Later that evening, he carried Margaret's letter onto the back porch. The old porch swing creaked gently beneath his weight. It had been their favorite place to watch summer sunsets. He unfolded the letter once again. This time, he noticed something he had missed before. At the bottom of the final page, Margaret had added a short handwritten note, one single paragraph. "David, if this day ever comes, remember something I learned while watching our children grow. People sometimes lose their way. That doesn't always mean they're lost forever. Justice protects a family. Mercy gives it a chance to heal. Only you will know which one they need." David read those words over and over again. The wind gently rustled the maple tree Margaret had planted when Emily was born. Its branches stretched high above the roof, stronger than ever despite countless storms. David suddenly understood what Margaret had truly left him. Not instructions, not revenge. A choice. The following morning, David rose before sunrise. He brewed coffee exactly the way Margaret used to. Strong, no sugar. He looked around the kitchen one last time. Every cupboard, every chair, every scratch on the old dining table. 45 years of life couldn't be measured in legal documents. They lived inside memories. At 9 o'clock, David arrived once more at Jonathan Reed's office. Emily and Ethan were already waiting. Neither spoke. Emily's eyes were swollen from crying. Ethan looked as though he hadn't slept at all. Jonathan stood as David entered. "Good morning, David." David nodded politely. "I've made my decision." Jonathan looked at him carefully. "Are you certain?" David took a slow breath. "I've never been more certain of anything." He turned towards his children. Emily couldn't stop trembling. Ethan slowly stood. "Dad," before either of them could say another word, David quietly raised one hand. "Please, I need you both to listen." The room fell completely silent. David looked at the two children he had loved from the moment they were born. Then he began to speak. No one moved. The sealed envelope lay in the center of the table like a final verdict waiting to be delivered. Jonathan rested his hand on it for a moment before carefully breaking the seal. The room was so quiet that the sound of the paper tearing seemed almost deafening. He unfolded the single document inside. Unlike Margaret's letter, this page was written in formal legal language. Jonathan adjusted his glasses. "I'll begin with Margaret's personal statement before reading the legal clause." He cleared his throat. "My dear family, if you have reached this page, then the hardest part of my plan has become necessary. I never wanted my children to be punished. I wanted them to remember who they were before money whispered louder than love." Emily lowered her eyes. Jonathan continued, "David spent his life protecting this family. If one day he needs protection from his own family, then I must protect him in my place." David felt tears gathering once again. Even after 6 years, Margaret somehow still knew how to stand beside him. Jonathan turned to the legal section. His voice became calm and precise. Article 9. Any beneficiary who knowingly attempts to manipulate, pressure, deceive, isolate, or financially exploit David Harrison during his lifetime shall immediately forfeit their primary inheritance rights under the Harrison Family Trust. Emily's head snapped up. "What?" Jonathan continued without interruption. "Any attempt to force relocation, improperly obtain financial authority, arrange the sale of trust property without legal consent, or otherwise act against David Harrison's clearly expressed wishes shall constitute evidence of exploitation." Emily's face turned pale. "No, Jonathan looked directly at her. The trust specifically includes attempted actions. It does not require those actions to succeed. Emily slowly shook her head. This isn't fair. I never forced him. Jonathan calmly opened another folder. Would you like me to review the evidence? Emily remained silent. Jonathan placed several documents on the table. The preliminary property sales package, the correspondence with the estate agency, the appointment arranged with the retirement community, the request submitted to David's financial advisor, the inquiry made at his bank. Each document landed softly on the table. Each one felt heavier than the last. Emily stared at them in disbelief. You've been watching us, Jonathan answered quietly. No, I've been protecting my client. Across the table, Ethan buried his face in his hands. I told you we were going too far, he whispered. Emily looked at him in shock. You agreed with me. I followed you, Ethan replied, his voice trembling. I didn't stop you. That's my fault. But I never wanted to take Dad's home. For the first time since the meeting began, David spoke. Ethan. His son slowly looked up. When was the last time you came to visit me without talking about my future? Ethan couldn't answer. He realized he couldn't remember. David sighed. That's what hurts. It isn't the paperwork. It isn't the money. It's that somewhere along the way, I stopped being your father and became a problem to solve. Emily began crying openly. Dad, I made terrible decisions. I thought I was being practical. I kept telling myself we'd all benefit eventually. David looked at her sadly. But did you ever ask what I wanted? She covered her face. No. Jonathan waited until the room became quiet again before reading the final paragraph of the trust. Despite all legal protections described above, the grantor Margaret Harrison leaves one final decision entirely to David Harrison. Everyone looked towards him. Jonathan continued. David alone may restore, reduce, or permanently revoke any beneficiary's inheritance rights. Emily stared at her father through tear-filled eyes. Dad, please. Jonathan closed the folder. The law has now finished speaking. He gently folded his hands. From this moment forward, the decision belongs only to David. David looked out of the window. Beyond the glass, the afternoon sun illuminated the same blue sky Margaret had loved. He could almost hear her voice, not telling him what to do, simply reminding him of the man he had always tried to be. After several long moments, David stood. He looked first at Ethan, then at Emily. Finally, he turned to Jonathan. I know what the law says. He paused. But before I decide, I want one night alone in my home. Jonathan nodded respectfully. Of course. David walked slowly toward the door. Just before leaving, he stopped without turning around. When I come back tomorrow, my decision won't change. Emily quietly broke down in tears. Neither she nor Ethan knew whether they were about to lose their inheritance forever or receive one final chance they no longer believed they deserved. The conference room at Jonathan Reed's law office was unusually quiet. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the polished oak table where 4 chairs had been arranged. David arrived first. He looked calm on the outside. Inside, however, his emotions were impossible to untangle. For nearly a week he had carried the weight of a secret that no father should ever have to bear. Today, that burden would finally be shared. Jonathan entered carrying Margaret's leather folder. He placed it carefully in the center of the table. Everything is ready, he said quietly. David nodded. A few minutes later, the receptionist opened the door. Mr. Reed, they're here. Emily walked in confidently, followed by Ethan. Emily smiled as though this were nothing more than a routine legal meeting. Good morning, Dad. David returned the greeting politely. Ethan looked noticeably uneasy. He avoided making eye contact with his father as he quietly took his seat. Jonathan waited until everyone was seated before speaking. Thank you for coming. I understand everyone has busy schedules. This meeting concerns the Harrison Family Trust and the future of David Harrison's estate. Emily leaned forward. I thought Dad's estate had already been organized years ago. Jonathan smiled politely. Most people believe that. Emily glanced briefly at Ethan. David noticed. Jonathan opened the leather folder before removing any documents. He looked around the room. Mrs. Margaret Harrison left very specific legal instructions. They required me to remain silent until certain conditions were met. Emily frowned. What conditions? Jonathan answered calmly. Evidence that David's well-being had become secondary to personal financial interests. The room became perfectly still. Emily laughed nervously. I'm not sure what that means. Jonathan reached into the folder and removed several documents. The first item is the Harrison Family Trust. He handed copies to Emily and Ethan. Emily's confident expression slowly disappeared as she scanned the first page. What is this? Jonathan remained composed. The trust legally owns the Harrison residence, the investment accounts, the savings, and the majority of the Harrison estate. Emily looked up in deep. No, that can't be right. Jonathan slid another document across the table. The trust was established 8 years ago. It has been legally valid ever since. Emily rapidly turned the pages. But we were told the house belonged to Dad. It does. Jonathan nodded. He has lifetime occupancy and complete protection. But ownership is held by the trust. Emily looked stunned. So, he can't sell it? Jonathan corrected her. More importantly, neither can anyone else. Silence filled the room. David watched his daughter for a long moment. She looked less angry now, more frightened. Jonathan reached for the cream-colored envelope. I will now read Margaret Harrison's final letter exactly as she instructed. He carefully unfolded the pages. His voice remained steady. My beloved family, if this letter is being read today, something has gone terribly wrong. I always believed that love should come before money. If you have forgotten that lesson, then I have failed to remind you often enough. This house was never built as an investment. It was built as a home. Every wall carries our laughter. Every floor remembers our footsteps. Please don't reduce a lifetime of love to numbers on a contract. David quietly lowered his head. He could almost hear Margaret speaking. Across the table, Ethan wiped away a tear. Emily remained frozen. Jonathan continued reading. If either of my children ever values this house more than the man who built it, then they have already lost something far greater than any inheritance. Emily suddenly stood. I never wanted Dad to suffer. Jonathan looked at her calmly. No one has accused you. Emily's voice broke. I was trying to protect him. David finally spoke. Were you protecting me, or protecting the money? Emily couldn't answer. The silence was answer enough. Jonathan folded the letter carefully. There is one document remaining. He placed a sealed envelope on the table. Its cover bore Margaret's unmistakable handwriting. Final trust clause. Jonathan looked at each member of the family. I have not opened this. By Margaret's instructions, it is to be opened only after her letter has been read aloud. He rested his hand gently on the envelope. What is written inside will determine how the Harrison estate is distributed. Emily stared at the envelope as though her future depended on it, because it did. Jonathan slowly reached for the seal. David sat silently at his kitchen table long after the call ended. Jonathan's final words refused to leave his mind. It wasn't Emily. It was someone you've trusted for over 20 years. Who could that possibly be? He mentally listed the people who had been part of his life for decades. Neighbors, old friends, his family doctor, his accountant. None of them made sense. By the following morning, David found himself sitting once again across from Jonathan Reed. This time the attorney's expression was far more serious. I spoke with the bank manager again, Jonathan began. He agreed to give a formal statement if this matter goes any further. David nodded. Do they know who tried to change my account? They do. Jonathan slid a business card across the desk. David stared at the name. Richard Collins, his financial advisor. David felt the color drain from his face. Richard? Jonathan nodded. You've been his client for 23 years. David leaned back in disbelief. Richard had attended Margaret's funeral. He had visited David every Christmas. He had even brought flowers to the cemetery on Margaret's birthday one year. I don't understand. Jonathan folded his hands. Neither did the bank. They found it unusual that someone claiming to act in your best interest couldn't answer the basic security questions that only you would know. David shook his head slowly. I trusted him. I know. Jonathan opened Margaret's leather folder once more. I believe we've reached the point Margaret anticipated. From inside, he carefully lifted the cream-colored envelope. Its paper had become fragile with age, but Margaret's handwriting remained beautifully clear. For David, open only if our children forget who they are. Jonathan placed the envelope gently in front of David. This is the day your wife prepared for. David's hands trembled as he broke the old wax seal. Inside was a neatly folded letter. The familiar scent of lavender still lingered faintly on the paper. For a brief moment, it felt as though Margaret had just written it yesterday. He unfolded the first page. My dearest David, if you're reading this, then the future I prayed would never come has arrived. First, I need you to know something. None of what happens next is your fault. You loved our children with everything you had. You taught them kindness, honesty, and compassion. If they have lost their way, it is because every human being has the freedom to choose. Please don't spend your remaining years blaming yourself. David stopped reading, his vision blurred with tears. Margaret always knew exactly what to say. Jonathan quietly waited. After several moments, David continued. I've watched families fall apart over money before. Every time, they believed it could never happen to them. I hoped ours would be different. But hope is not a legal protection, so I created one. David looked up. Jonathan gave a small nod. Keep reading. The home, the saving, the investments, and nearly everything we built together were transferred into the Harrison family trust years before my death. No one may sell, transfer, borrow against, or control those assets without meeting the conditions written into the trust. David stared at Jonathan in complete shock. You mean? Jonathan finished the sentence. The house has never legally belonged to your children. David covered his mouth. Margaret never told me. She insisted I keep it confidential. She believed knowing about it would only create unnecessary suspicion while the family remained united. David looked back at the letter. There is one final instruction. His heartbeat quickened. He turned to the last page. If the day ever comes when this letter is opened, gather everyone together, write every word aloud. Only then should the final clause of the Harrison family trust be revealed. Not before, not after. Jonathan carefully returned the documents to the folder. I've already contacted Emily and Ethan. David looked up. You did? They believe we're meeting to discuss routine estate paperwork. When? Jonathan checked his watch. Tomorrow morning. David slowly folded Margaret's letter against his chest. For the first time since overhearing Emily's cruel words, he felt something stronger than heartbreak. He felt Margaret standing beside him once again, protecting him, guiding him, keeping the promise she had made years ago. As David stood to leave, Jonathan's phone rang. He answered, listened for several seconds. Then his expression changed. He looked directly at David. The estate agent just called. They've received a signed authorization to begin preparing the sale of your house. David frowned. I never signed anything. Jonathan's face became grim. I know. He slowly placed the phone on his desk, which means someone has. David's heart began to race. From Margaret's study, he could see part of the driveway through the window. A silver SUV had just stopped outside. Emily stepped out carrying her handbag and smiling as if it were an ordinary visit. David quickly slid the property folder back beneath the magazines exactly as Jonathan had instructed. He took one last look around the room. Nothing appeared out of place. A gentle knock echoed through the house. Dad, Emily called. Are you home? David took a slow breath before opening the front door. There you are, she said cheerfully. I tried calling. My phone was upstairs. She held up a paper shopping bag. I brought your favorite blueberry muffins. David thanked her with a smile that felt heavier than ever. As Emily walked inside, her eyes briefly drifted toward the hallway leading to Margaret's study. It lasted only a second, but David noticed. So, she said casually, what have you been doing today? Oh, just sorting through some old things. Emily's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. In Mum's study? David nodded. I haven't looked through her things in years. Emily quickly forced another smile. There isn't much in there worth keeping. David looked directly at her. Your mother's memories are worth keeping. For the first time that afternoon, Emily didn't know what to say. Instead, she changed the subject. Actually, I came because I brought someone with. David frowned. Someone? A man in his early 40s walked up the front steps carrying a leather briefcase. He wore an expensive suit and introduced himself with professional confidence. Good afternoon, Mr. Harrison. My name is Kevin Lawson. I'm a property consultant. David felt a chill run through his body. Emily laughed awkwardly. Don't worry, Dad. Kevin's only here to give us an idea of what the house might be worth. David slowly turned toward her. I don't remember asking for that. Emily folded her arms. We're just planning ahead. You always taught us to be practical. David studied Kevin's face. The man looked uncomfortable. Perhaps he had realized this meeting wasn't as straightforward as Emily had suggested. I'm sorry, Kevin said politely. I was told the family had already agreed to discuss selling. David answered calmly. The family hasn't. Silence filled the room. Emily stepped forward. Dad, you know you can't keep maintaining this place forever. It's too big, it's expensive, and honestly, she hesitated. You'd be happier somewhere smaller. David walked slowly into the living room. He looked around at the photographs covering the walls. Margaret holding baby Emily, 8-year-old Ethan proudly standing beside the treehouse they had built together. Family Christmases, birthdays, anniversaries. Every frame held a chapter of their lives. He turned back toward Emily. Do you know how many nights your mother and I stayed awake planning this house? Emily remained silent. Do you remember learning to ride your bicycle in this driveway? Still no answer. You scraped your knees 3 times that afternoon. You cried, and your mother carried you inside. Emily lowered her eyes. David continued softly. This isn't just a house. It's your mother's fingerprints on every wall. Kevin quietly closed his briefcase. I think this may not be the right time. He shook David's hand respectfully before leaving. As soon as the front door closed, Emily's patience disappeared. I don't understand why you're making this so difficult. David looked at her steadily. Difficult for whom? Emily opened her mouth but couldn't answer. She grabbed her handbag and stormed out of the house. The front door slammed behind her. For several minutes, David stood completely still. Then his phone vibrated. It was Jonathan. I've just received a call from your bank, the attorney said. David frowned. My bank? Someone attempted to inquire about changing the authorized signatory on one of your investment accounts. David's stomach tightened. I didn't authorize anything. I know. Jonathan's voice became more serious. The bank refused the request because something didn't match. David leaned heavily against the kitchen counter. They're moving faster than I thought. Jonathan paused. David, I believe we're no longer dealing with assumptions. We're dealing with evidence. Before ending the call, Jonathan added one final sentence. And there's something else. The bank manager recognized the woman who made the inquiry. David closed his eyes. He already knew the answer, but he forced himself to ask anyway. Who was it? Jonathan's reply came quietly. It wasn't Emily. It was someone you've trusted for over 20 years. David drove home with Jonathan's warning echoing in his mind. Don't confront them. Let the truth reveal itself. For 72 years, David had believed that honesty solved almost every problem. If something was wrong, you sat down, talked it through, and found a solution together. Remaining silent felt unnatural, but Jonathan had spent decades handling family disputes. David trusted him, so, for the first time in his life, he decided to observe instead of react. The opportunity came sooner than he expected. The following afternoon, Emily arrived exactly on time. She carried a cheerful smile, a takeaway coffee for her father, and a glossy brochure. "Morning, Dad," she said brightly. "Ready for our little trip?" David smiled politely. "Where are we going again?" "Just to look at a retirement community," she laughed softly. "No pressure. I only want you to see how nice it is." David nodded. All right. The retirement community was beautiful. Fresh gardens, affordable apartments, friendly staff. It looked less like a nursing home and more like an expensive hotel. Emily enthusiastically pointed at everything. "They have a library, a fitness center, restaurant-style dining. You wouldn't have to worry about mowing the lawn anymore." David listened quietly, then Emily added the sentence that made his stomach tighten, "And once you move in, we can finally deal with the house." David looked at her. "What do you mean?" "Oh," she smiled casually. "I just mean it'll be easier to sell while the market's still strong." She said it so naturally, as though selling the family home had already been decided. David forced another smile. "We'll think about it." Emily seemed satisfied. She believed he had accepted the idea. She had no reason to suspect otherwise. That evening, David received another visitor, his son Ethan. Unlike Emily, Ethan looked uncomfortable. He stood in the kitchen holding a small toolbox. "I noticed your back gate was loose," he said. "I thought I'd fix it." David smiled. "You always were good with your hands." Ethan laughed. "I learned from you." For nearly an hour they worked together in silence. It reminded David of happier years. When Ethan finally packed up his tools, he hesitated. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Of course. If Emily ever talks about..." Selling remained calm. "What about it?" Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. "I don't know. I hope nobody pressures you." David looked carefully at his son's face. There was guilt in his eyes, not greed, fear. Before David could respond, Ethan's phone rang. "Emily," he answered immediately. "Yeah?" David couldn't hear Emily's voice, but he could hear Ethan's answers. "No, he hasn't signed anything. I'm trying. Just give me some time." Ethan noticed David watching him. His face turned pale. "I have to go." He left almost immediately. David stood alone on the front porch long after Ethan's truck disappeared. Jonathan had been right. They weren't simply discussing possibilities. There was already a plan. The next morning, David decided to organize some old paperwork in Margaret's study. Most of the drawers contained family photographs, tax records, and faded birthday cards. Then he noticed a folder that didn't belong. It had been tucked beneath a stack of magazines. The cover read, "Harrison Property, Preliminary Sales Package." David slowly opened it. Inside were professional photographs of his home, a property valuation, estimated selling price, marking notes, and a draft listing agreement. At the bottom of one page was a handwritten note, "Waiting for owner relocation before listing publicly." David felt the room begin to spin. They hadn't merely discussed selling the house. Someone had already begun preparing for it. Just then, his mobile phone rang. Jonathan Reed. Before David could say hello, Jonathan spoke urgently. "David, I need you to leave every document exactly where you found it. Someone else may be coming back for that folder." David looked down at the papers scattered across Margaret's desk. Then he heard something that made his blood run cold. The sound of a car door closing outside. Someone had just pulled into his driveway. David barely slept after Jonathan Reed's unexpected phone call. For years, Margaret's attorney had been little more than a distant memory. Jonathan had handled their estate planning shortly before Margaret's illness became serious. After her funeral, David believed every legal matter had been settled. So why would Jonathan call now? And why did his voice sound as though he had been expecting this day? The next morning, David drove across town to Jonathan's office. The building looked exactly as he remembered: dark brick walls, tall oak doors, a brass plaque polished so carefully that it reflected the morning sun. Jonathan greeted him with a warm handshake. Although his hair had turned almost completely white, his calm expression hadn't changed. "I'm sorry we have to meet again under these circumstances," Jonathan said quietly. David nodded. "I don't understand any of this." "I know." Jonathan motioned toward a chair. "Please sit." For a moment neither man spoke. Jonathan opened an old filing cabinet and carefully removed a thick leather folder. It looked worn with age. A small handwritten label read, Margaret Harrison, Private Instructions. David stared at it. "I've never seen that before." "You weren't supposed to." Jonathan placed the folder gently on the desk. "Margaret asked me to keep these documents confidential unless a very specific condition was met." David frowned. "What condition?" Jonathan looked directly into his eyes. "If your children ever placed personal gain above your well-being." David's breath caught. The words echoed through the quiet office. He remembered Emily's voice. Dad's worth more to us after he's gone. His hands tightened around the chair. She actually thought something like this could happen. Jonathan gave a slow nod. Margaret loved your children deeply, but she also understood that grief, money, and outside influences can sometimes change people. David looked away. She never told me. She didn't want you living with suspicion. Jonathan reached into the folder and carefully removed a cream-colored envelope. Its edges had yellowed over the years. Across the front, written in Margaret's familiar handwriting, were the words, "For David. Open only if our children forget who they are." David felt tears filling his eyes. He recognized every curve of her handwriting. For a moment it felt as though she were sitting beside him again. "I want to read it," David whispered. Jonathan gently shook his head. "Not yet." David looked up in surprise. "What do you mean?" "There are legal instructions attached to this letter." Margaret was very clear. "The envelope cannot be opened until I confirm that the condition she described has been legally satisfied." David's voice trembled. "And has it?" Jonathan remained silent for several seconds. "I believe we're very close." He slid another document across the desk. "I need you to answer one question honestly." David nodded. "Have either of your children recently asked you to sign legal documents, suggested moving you into assisted living, or shown unusual interest in your finances or home?" David hesitated. Then he slowly remembered the conversations from the past few months. Emily insisting the house was becoming too much for him. Emily offering to help organize his bank accounts. Emily repeatedly mentioning a retirement community. Until now, he had believed she was simply worried about him. "I think," David said quietly, "I think all of those things have happened." Jonathan sighed. "I'm afraid that's what I expected." He closed the folder carefully. "David, I need you to promise me something." "What is it?" "No matter what happens next, don't confront your children." David stared at him. "Why?" "Because people reveal far more when they believe no one is watching." Jonathan stood and walked towards the window. If Margaret was right, they haven't finished yet. At that exact moment, David's phone buzzed. It was a text message from Emily. "Dad, I found a wonderful assisted living community. I booked us a tour tomorrow. You're going to love it." David slowly lowered the phone. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure whether his daughter was trying to protect him or remove him. David Harrison had spent 45 years building the little white house at the end of Maple Street. Every brick had passed through his hands. Every window had been installed beside his wife, Margaret. Every tree in the front yard had been planted for one of their children's birthdays. To most people, it was just another quiet suburban home. To David, it was the story of an entire lifetime. Now 72 years old, he lived there alone. Margaret had passed away 6 years earlier after a long battle with cancer, leaving behind countless memories and a silence that never truly disappeared. David missed her every single day. Still, he believed he was fortunate. His daughter Emily visited almost every weekend. His son Ethan stopped by whenever work allowed. They often reminded him that family always came first. David believed them. He never imagined that everything he thought he knew would collapse in a single sentence. It happened on an ordinary Thursday evening. Emily had invited herself over for dinner. She insisted on washing the dishes while David relaxed in the living room. When his tea grew cold, David walked quietly toward the kitchen. Halfway down the hallway, he heard Emily speaking on her phone. Her voice was low, almost careful. David wasn't trying to listen, he was simply passing by. Then he heard the words. "Honestly," she laughed softly, "Dad's worth more to us after he's gone." David stopped walking. For a brief moment, he wondered if he had misunderstood. Perhaps she was talking about someone else's father. Perhaps there was another explanation. Then she continued, "We just have to be patient. He doesn't know anything. Once the house is sold." Her voice faded as she walked toward the back porch. David couldn't hear the rest. He didn't need to. His knees suddenly felt weak. He leaned against the hallway wall to steady himself. His heart pounded so loudly that he could barely hear anything else. This couldn't be happening. Emily had been the little girl who used to fall asleep on his shoulder while he read bedtime stories. She had cried for hours at Margaret's funeral. She had promised she would always look after him. So why had she just spoken about him as though he were already dead? David quietly returned to the living room before Emily could see him. When she came back a few minutes later, she smiled as if nothing had happened. "Everything okay, Dad?" David forced a small smile. "Everything's fine." He had spent his entire life teaching his children that honesty mattered. Now he was pretending not to know the truth. That night, sleep never came. He sat alone in the darkness, staring at an old photograph of Margaret. Finally, just before sunrise, his phone rang. The caller ID displayed a name he hadn't seen in almost 15 years. Jonathan Reed, Margaret's attorney. David answered with trembling hands. "Mr. Harrison," Jonathan said calmly, "I believe it's finally time for us to meet."